right, let's start recording the mixer in five, four, three.
Some people in this world are on the front lines of the struggle between good and evil, and some, like us, bear witness. I'm Therese Apel.
And I'm Nicole Kral. You may have heard us as we worked on stories and series about law enforcement and crime. And it's safe to say we've seen some of the best and worst of human nature.
We decided there's no greater honor than bringing you the stories of the men and women who seek out the monsters, who speak for the victims, and who put the pieces together on some of the biggest Mississippi crime stories of our time.
Welcome to Investigation Homicide.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Investigation Homicide. It has been literally a month since we were here. Holidays get nuts, don't they?
Yes, they do. And I don't think we were expecting it to get this crazy. But when we just, Daniel was putting up our new little screen thing, and it said November 13th.
Was our last one, yeah.
So it's a little over a month, but I think we're both happy to be back.
Oh, yeah. Glad to be back.
Swing of things.
And of course, then we'll have Christmas and New Year's off.
Yes, we will. Thank you guys for allowing us to do that.
You're
have
right.
that time with our friends and family.
Yeah, and we will find some other good episodes that we've run in the past that we can do reruns for. So you guys will have that. Today, Nicole, as you know, we have a special episode. Let me start by saying today's episode is about the Jessica Chambers case. I want to dedicate it first and foremost to my friend Paul Rowlett, who was killed in a car crash a couple of weeks ago, driving from Florida to Louisiana to testify in the trial against the suspect we'll talk about today. And it's devastating. He is the third of the investigative team that have died on this case. There does seem very much to be a curse on it. So this is also in honor of John Champion, the district attorney, and Tim Douglas, the MBI investigator that worked this case. We brought in one of my good friends, Ron Maxey. He is a Memphis-area journalist, has worked for a couple different outlets up there, but at the time was with the Memphis Commercial Appeal, and he and I worked on this case together because we were both with the USA Today network. Ron, we are so glad to have you here. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Ron.
Thanks for having me. Nice to be here.
So tell us a little bit about you and what you're up to now, and kind of fill in the gaps for us in your life, and then we will launch into the story.
Okay. Well, I've actually been retired for coming up on a couple of years. I retired for good the end of 2023. I retired from the Commercial Appeal after 40 years at the end of 2018. Took a week off, and the next week I started a new job at the Daily Memphian, which is an online general news publication here. I was Metro editor there for 5 years, and retired at the end of 2023 for keeps. Since then, I've done a few freelance pieces, but my time these days is mainly playing with grandchildren and doing some freelance work and some volunteer work. And that's kind of where I am now. But the last big thing I did before leaving the Commercial Appeal was the Jessica Chambers case. I covered both of the trials, which I'm sure we'll talk about. And
Sure.
I think we both worked on the first. I know we tag teamed the second trial, but
Yes.
Yeah, we were on the first. So anyway, that's where I am. I'm retired now, but still keeping abreast of the news. Somewhat have lost touch with the case since it moved to Louisiana. You can obviously talk a lot more about that, but the memories of the Mississippi trials are very fresh in my memory.
It's kind of one of those things that if you were there, you'll never forget it. I think that's the crazy part, is that, the whole world has talked about this case. I mean, literally all over the world, there are people who have talked about this case and still do, but there are some of us that lived it.
Yeah, really. I think when you and I were talking about this earlier, I mentioned that if you ask people to list the most horrific ways they can think of to die, if being burned alive is not at the top of their list, it's going to be pretty high on the list. And so this caught the public imagination early on, and those of us who worked on it certainly had an impact on us. And yeah, it's just something that kind of sticks with you.
Absolutely. Now, let me go ahead and say that we have not asked any of the investigators that, well, I guess there's Scott Meadows with the ATF is still out there somewhere, and ADA Jay Hale, well, now he's the district attorney, Jay Hale, is still out there, and we didn't bring them in because this case is still open.
Right. Yeah, it's very much open in Mississippi, as I'm sure you'll talk about it. It ended in 2 hung juries, and it's, will it come back to Mississippi? I'm sure we'll be talking about that, but it's still very much an open case.
That's right. So let's start off. I'll go ahead and kind of walk us through where I was, and then we can go to where you were at the time that this happened. So it was December 6th of 2014, and it happened on Heron Road in Cortland. Cortland's a town of about 15. I mean, I'm sorry, about 500 people, and Jessica Chambers. There was a call out to a car fire, and the firefighters got there, and she walks up to them, and she's still on fire, and they're able to wrap her up in a blanket, and as they're trying to find out what happened here, she's saying something that sounds like a name. Now, in the time since that happened, I've done a dozen interviews, and I just sat down with Daniel Cole, the EOC director, a couple of weeks ago, and we talked about it again. And of course, Ron, as you and I know, because it came out in court, there was no way her body could have actually made a full name, but it sounded at the time like she was saying Eric or Derek.
Yeah, it really did. As you said, there was a lot of medical testimony in the second trial about how she was so badly burned, her tongue was basically burned away. There was no way she could have really enunciated anything, but she made some sounds that investigator after investigator, or responder after responder, said sounded like a name, either Eric or Derek, and which played a very, I think, was the key factor in the outcome of that trial. Her defense team, or his defense team, to their credit, really was able to create doubt with that name. But the medical testimony seemed pretty compelling, but they just could not get past what responders thought they heard.
That's right. So during the time that they're on the scene, of course, this is all going on. There were a lot of mistakes made at the scene that night, and that's something that we found out through the years that maybe necessarily didn't come out at the time of the case or the trial. Long story short, we come around to they've investigated a bunch of Erics and Dereks. They've looked through a bunch of things, and through the years, bits and pieces of that have leaked out. But I think at some point we'll know the whole story there. But they wind up coming back a year later and looking at all the evidence again. And that's when Paul Rowlett is looking at the phone data, and he realizes he makes a minor calculation different. And all of a sudden, everything lines up. And there is a suspect they looked at the beginning named Quentin Tellis, who had been with her that last day. And he had told him that after he had left her, he had gone. At first, his story was that he was with a guy named Big Mike, that he was not with her anymore. But the information that Paul was looking at lined up with Tellis's phone and Jessica's phone in the same, like following the same track to Batesville and following the same track from there. So that's where the case really started to catch, traction. Now, do you remember where you were when what happened in your life when they announced that they had a suspect in this case?
Yeah, well, unlike you, I was not a crime reporter, so I probably was not on this as early as you were. I certainly didn't have the law enforcement contacts I'm sure you had talked to. At the time, I was a general assignment reporter covering primarily DeSoto County, because DeSoto County is part of the Memphis metro area. But for any big story, we would venture, anywhere in North Mississippi, really. And this story caught on pretty early, and I can't remember exactly at what point I came in. I think it was when John Champion, who was the DA at the time, he was based in Hernando in DeSoto County. I think they announced that they had put out a reward. I forget the amount, but they had put out a reward seeking information for a suspect. And I think that's where I came onto the story, and I began to talk to some people and get the details of this horrible crime. And I just remember the image I had in my mind. I think it was John Champion I was talking to, and he just because I joked with him at the time, he should have been a journalist because he painted such an eerie word picture, such an accurate word picture about how this was. As you said, Cortland's a tiny community, maybe 500 people. So, you can imagine out on a country road late at night in a place like Cortland, it was dark. I mean, it was as dark and as remote as could be. And responders come up and they just see this glow of a car on fire. And then after a couple of minutes, they see a zombie-like figure also on fire walking out from this car. And he described that scene to me. And that's from early on, that's the image that sticks with me most. And I said at that point, yeah, any journalist worth their weight knows this is a story you've got to go with.
Yeah.
And that's how I became involved with it. And then I think when they announced, they had a press conference where they announced they had charged Tellus, and it sort of picked up steam from there. And I probably didn't cover it on a day-to-day basis quite as thoroughly as you did, but I was on all the high points of it. I was with it from that point on.
What was your take on the Eric and Derek thing before the trial?
Yeah, before the trial, I didn't really. I said I don't not sure how much stock I put in this. And I know one of the times early on. Well, this was actually the last time I talked to Lisa Chambers after the trial. I think the last time I interviewed her was maybe in December 2018. I can't remember when she passed away, but it
That's
was.
Jessica's mom, right?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Lisa. Yeah,
Yeah.
Jessica's mom, and she had her own theory on the whole Derek and Eric thing. She said she thought that Jessica was disoriented, and when they asked who did this, she thought they were actually asking what happened, and she thought she had had a wreck, so she was trying to say a wreck, and it came out sounding like Derek or Eric. That was her theory, and on what was said, and that made sense to me. I don't know if there was anything to that or not. I never heard anybody else run with that theory, but that's what she told me. But I was intrigued by it from the start. I wasn't really sure how much stock to put in it.
Yeah. Well, and so while they're going through all this, I think if you look on the internet, you're going to see where they say, well, allegedly 10 Erics and Dereks were interviewed, but I think it came out in court. They looked into, if they didn't interview, they looked into, I want to say it was more than 400 Erics, Dereks, and a Jarek
Yeah,
in the area surrounding Panola County and the counties around it.
right.
So while the world was saying, "Why are we looking at someone named Quentin Tellis? Why aren't we looking for Eric?" They had been looking for Eric.
Yeah,
And in my brain, it's like kind of logical. Eric and Derek are both two-syllable names, but so is Quentin and so is Tellis.
Yeah.
So, and if you are any sort of logical person, I feel like, and you know the situation of the crime is that she was burning alive, in the process of burning alive. She's from the inside out.
Yeah.
She's probably not gonna have the ability to enunciate, and whether she was saying Eric, Derek, Quentin, Tellis, or mama, daddy, help me, whatever,
Mhm.
like, I just feel like that might be kind of a red herring.
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, and I think that's where, as we'll find out when we talk about the trials, of course, you had a knockout team on the prosecution that, did a great job putting a case together, but you also had a really good defense team with Darla Palmer and, Alton Peterson, who came in and knew how to hit those points, so we'll get to that, but, I also wanna encourage you, audience, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in there. I know sometimes there's discussion on this, and sometimes you'd rather just listen. So either way. So as we go through the part of the investigation where we don't know who our suspect is, there are people out there saying, "Hey, they're not doing anything. This case has gone cold." Did you hear that, Ron?
yeah. I did too. There was a lot of frustration. A lot of it. I don't think people really appreciate how long it can take and how methodical they have to be in putting together a case. But there was a lot of frustration that so much time seemed to pass, and there was just nobody coming forward. Of course, a small community where everyone knew one another, and again, the horrific nature of this crime, people wanted answers in a hurry, and they just initially they just weren't coming, and there was a lot of frustration that I sensed.
Well, and I think to me, one thing that really stands out as we talk about those days, that don't seem like they're 11 years ago now, but so when you think about the role that the national media played during that time, what's your take on that? Because they came down like I don't know, I want to say like a bunch of spiders. There they were all over the place.
Yeah, they really did, and it's just we can appreciate it. We know how that works. You sort of parachute into a story, and you have to, you do what you can. But still, they didn't know the players, they didn't know the community, and there's sort of this herd mentality. People start feeding off of one another, going with rumors, and something will just catch fire is probably poor choice of words in this
Sure.
case. Something will really catch on, and everybody just runs with it. And I found myself on a few occasions thinking, man, where did they come up with this? I haven't heard anybody saying this, and it's just that got really frustrating at times too, because you're in there. You're in there jockeying with people who they're here today, they're going to be gone next week, and don't care anything about the community. And it got really frustrating dealing with it sometimes. But you can understand it. It was a big story, and they were going to be there too, and should have been. I'm glad it got the attention it did, because we need answers in this and need a resolution. But it got frustrating, as it does with any national story like this.
Sure. And do you remember how much social media and the internet, the bloggers and that kind of thing played in?
Yeah.
What a big deal that was.
Yeah, and I mean, thank the Lord it's not today, because it's exponentially worse today than it would have been then.
Right.
But you get people and talk about wondering where people got this and some of the theories people come up with. I shudder to think where we would be today if we had the so-called experts on social media at the time trying to solve this case the way they do now.
Well, I think this was the first case where I'd ever seen that phenomenon.
Yeah.
This is the first time I'd ever actually seen that happen, and where I had to block people on Twitter because they were just coming at me with all kinds of nuts stuff and that kind of thing. And to me, what was good and bad, and I was just thinking about this the other day, but what was good and bad about it is, these people, and particularly there was one website I remember they were digging up all these things on pretty much everyone in the community.
Yeah.
What that did for me was I could take the names that they put out and I could go do my own research, but that affected very much the way that I investigated the case, and I know it also affected the way investigators had to deal with the case. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think so too. I would, I would follow, and as you said, sometimes you would get some useful information. Some of these citizen journalists, sometimes will latch on to something that is worth pursuing. I don't know that they really have the resources or know the proper way to do it, but they'll put a bit of information in there that turns out to have at least an element of truth to it, and you'll pick up and run with that. And I found it useful, but more often than not, it was just frustrating. It was spreading a lot of disinformation that I had to spend time correcting impressions that were out there, when I could have been better utilizing my time on this case, following leads of my own. So there are some productive aspects to it, but a lot of frustrating also.
Absolutely, and that, again, was one of the first times I'd seen that dynamic.
Yeah, I can imagine. Like, I mean, I've worked with you for a while, and it was I think that was kind of what people your name is all over that case. If you
Mhm.
Google Jessica Chambers, your name pops up all the time, and you've been on documentaries and stuff. And so I remember when we first started working together that people would always ask you about Jessica Chambers and ask you about Jessica Chambers. And it's like, how many, like, it's the information is out there. You have
Mhm.
written article after article after article after article. And
Right.
if there's anybody that somebody can trust about this story, it's you. So just go read what's out there. We all know Therese is not going to be one to make up facts. She's going to get all her sources. But I think it's just really interesting how this kind of like personified as a part of you.
Oh, wow, yeah. Yeah, it definitely is, and I think, Ron, maybe it's this way for you too, but it is kind of like when I talk about my career, this one always comes up.
Yep.
And I feel lucky to have been able to be a part of some of it, but it is so unresolved. It's kind of that thing that I'm gonna carry forever,
Yeah.
especially some of the aftermath. From day one, this case seemed to be cursed, and I think we've seen that through the years. Um, so, Ron, when you found out about Tellis, what was your first move at that point? Did you go research him? What did you do from there?
Yeah, I did some background research on him. Of course, I hit the internet and public records and so forth to see what I could find on him. And I can't recall what turned up initially, if it was very much or not. But the more people I talked to, and the more I found out about him, uh, there were certainly some questionable things there that it made you think that this could be a very valid suspect. It was not, he was not someone who ran in the best circles, had the best friends, and so he very quickly, to me, emerged as someone who could. And then I heard about his connections with Jessica, and he very quickly became someone who, this could be the person we're looking for.
Sure. Well, and one of the things, so the way I found out about him, I found out before they actually released anything. I had a good source that was telling me things, and he said at one point, "Hey, so the guy that we think is going to be it was released from MDOC a few months before Jessica was killed." So I did a public records request to MDOC, and I asked for everyone who had been released from state custody to Panola County, and just started going down the list. And so when I came up with Tellus, that was where I really kind of started to put pieces together on his gang affiliations and things like that. So when they put the name out, I thought, as we do, Ron, I know you'll recognize this. I thought I was about to break it, and I was just waiting for John to say, "Okay, go ahead." And then I was on Twitter, and I had put out something that said, tomorrow there's going to be a press conference, and da da da. And somebody said, "Is it going to be the indictment of Quentin Verdell Tellus?"
Yeah.
And I was like, "Oh no!" So at that point,
How?
of course, yeah. How did somebody know? So at that point, I was able to put out my story and kind of get the jump on it. But to me, the interesting thing that we found out, I think we found it out at that first press conference, was that he was in prison in Louisiana, or at least in jail, awaiting trial on a case that involved some credit card fraud, but it was connected to a girl that had been tortured to death. When did you learn about that, or do you remember?
Yeah, I don't remember the exact sequence of events, but it was after I began to read about his gang affiliations and so on. At some point after that, I got into this Louisiana case, and just it was, of course, it was not the same circumstances, but in the sense that it was a truly horrific case. It was very similar to the Jessica Chambers case. This is someone who in Louisiana who was basically tortured to death to get credit card information out of her. And when that information emerged, putting together with what we already knew about his connections in Cortland, I started thinking it's we're on to a pretty bad dude here. I think I seem to recall asking John Chambers about it at the time, and yeah, he just shook his head and said, "Yeah, this is a bad guy in multiple states."
Yeah. I remember one of the quotes that I've used of his past his death, is he said something about, "This is probably one of the more violent suspects I've ever seen," something to that effect.
Yeah,
Um, so I kind of want to get into Louisiana a little bit, but that trial actually starts January 5th. So we don't know all the things yet, but we do know that in this situation, it was a girl who was a Taiwanese. She was a graduate student, had just graduated. And long story short, he had kind of befriended her, and she was giving him her pain pills. And so they're on camera going to Walmart, and then Paul Rowlett was able to do some work that showed their phones together and showed Tellus's phone in her apartment, and there are some other things that tie him to that scene. But one of the problems they have is that there is no Tellus's DNA is not there. That's easily explained away though, because Mandy, as she was called, was killed 7 or 8 days before they found her in the August heat. Incidentally, she was found on Quentin Tellus's wedding day. But any, stray DNA would have degraded in her body's, decomposition. So that was a problem that they had, but they also had other stuff, like he had some tennis shoes he had spray painted white, and when they looked at these shoes, there was blood underneath them, but of course the spray paint had broken down any DNA that was possible, that kind of thing. So he was taken into custody. He was arrested on the credit card charges because they've got him on some ATM cameras. They've got some things that link him to that. But they didn't go forward at the time in 2015 with the murder case. So we've had a whole lot of time pass since then. And of course, what it the Chambers case curse where it affects Louisiana, of course, is that Paul was going to be the pretty much the star expert witness in that case too. And he had a unique way of being able to put together cell phone data, banking information, um, surveillance footage, that kind of thing, to draw you an actual picture of what this person's day looked like. And so right now, I understand that the prosecution's trying to find somebody else that can help fill that in. So the thing we're worried about is what happens next. If Tellus is guilty of these two things, what happens in his trial in Louisiana?
Yeah, and it's of course you're more familiar with the Louisiana case than I am, but it's of course the big question mark is if what happens, do they try him a third time in Mississippi? I guess that depends on the disposition of the Louisiana case, but a lot seems to hinge on what happens down there. I know everybody wants to see him get justice somewhere. I mean, Angola, Parchman, take your pick. Either would be a an appropriate setting, if not the death penalty. But there needs to be justice for him, somewhere. So everyone's real curious to see what will happen.
Absolutely. Now we have a question from one of our favorite commenters, Jordan Ricks. He says, we both covered this case from the very beginning. How did reporting on such an emotionally brutal crime affect the way we approach the sources, facts, and even language and dictation as a journalist? Ron, what was that like for you, the emotions of this case?
Yeah, it really was. Of course, it affects you personally too. I mean, none of us just automatically turn this stuff off when we go home at night. You do to some extent, but it's something like this. It sticks with you. You see brutal footage at the trial. You hear things from people as you're talking to them, and it sticks with you. And it does. I always in any. I got my good training ground on this was the beginning of my career. I did obituaries, and I learned how to be very delicate with families and very gentle and sort of let them lead the way with talking to somebody for an obituary. And a lot of that carried over with me in dealing with a story like this. Not so much the investigators, they know how to deal with it, but when you're dealing with family members and people of the public, you do approach them in a more gentle way. You can be probing and get the information you need, but be a decent person about it too. And you learn how to approach people gently. And it did have an effect on the way I talked to people in this story, because it was just so incredibly horrific, everything about it.
Do you feel the same way?
I do, and I think for me, there's the TV journalist, the one that they put on all the crime shows, who's running in there. How do you feel? That kind of thing. Did you kill her? That kind of thing. And that's what we definitely didn't want to be, because we are talking about a town of 500. We're talking about, like, I remember going into a gas station shortly after it happened and asking people about it, and they were so affected. And something I want to say, and I've checked this with other people that live in Cortland. So this is, at first I thought maybe it was my read on it, but it is real. In Cortland, they all live together. Okay, like you grew up next to Bob and Jim and whatever. Nobody was. I mean, yes, they could look at each other and say, my skin is white, yours is black. But it wasn't about race, because they had all lived in this tiny community together for so long. But as soon as the news came in, as soon as, the world is looking at them, and then you have, throw in the racial aspect. It's in Mississippi, so obviously there's a race card, that needs to be thrown on this. It hurt the community. And I remember a year after it happened, I was walking into the same gas station, and a guy saw me coming in and he said, I know who you are. And I said, oh, okay, you want to talk to me about the case? And he was like, no, I don't. He said, you and all of y'all came in here and you effed us up. Like, we had a nice community here, and we all got along, and you came in here and you drove a wedge. And I was like, hold up, man, I'm local. I'm Mississippi. And he's like, it doesn't matter. Y'all are all the same. So for me, there was very much a feeling that we needed to treat this with great integrity, because this town, not only, I mean, the Panola County Sheriff's Department did everything they could. They did the best they could, but they were not ready for something this big. Who is? And then you had the investigation team that was the state and federal guys. And I think as I got to know not just the community, but also the investigative teams, I remember telling one day, I told one of them, I said, "This case to me is about y'all too." And it really, I think all of it informed my reporting with the understanding that I remember right after the first trial when the jury hung, I went out to Jessica's grave and I did a Facebook Live, and it was like, "I need all of you who are gawking at this from all over the country, to whom this is just the latest story that you wanna solve from your kitchen table. I need y'all to know that Jessica was an actual person, and she had actual family, and they're actual, men and women who have given their lifeblood to find the person that did this." And, we all just sat through a really, really hard trial, and the fact that it wasn't resolved is really hard for us. So I think, Jordan, in answer to your question, it changed a lot. I wouldn't say it drastically changed the way I reported, but it changed it in a lot of ways that I think are more subtle and long term, to say the least.
Yeah, Therese, if I could add one thing, you mentioned it's interesting. You mentioned the racial aspect and how close knit everyone is in the community. I think the last story I did on this was it was a color piece, and I talked on the anniversary of a death. I guess I don't remember how many years after it was, maybe 5. But I talked to some people in little restaurant, I think called The Place,
Yeah.
which is the place to eat in Cortland. It's at the railroad tracks, and went in and just talked to some people there, and a couple of women who were employees there. One was white, the other was black, and they were both recounting how the day they heard about it, or I guess it was the next day they heard about it after it happened. They were just crying and they started hugging one another, which is not something they normally did, but this was their community, and it didn't matter what color she was, what color the suspect was. It deeply affected all of them. And I remember both of you saying, um, just be careful what you say about this because it affects all of us, everybody here. And so, it has an impact on you. If you've got any feelings at all, reporter or not, it affects you in the way you report on it.
Well, and let me ask you too, were you interviewed for the Oxygen documentary series?
I think I was, yeah. You were, as I recall, you were in that a lot more than I was, as you should have been. But yeah, I was in that also, and uh, I can't remember specifically what was asked. What were your impressions on that? How do you?
Well, I'll say that some of us that were in it ended up somehow with IMDb pages, which was, your first clue that this was not a documentary, it was entertainment.
Right,
But when I found out I had an IMDb page, I went and started paying the 19.99 a month to control my own IMDb page,
right.
simply so I can have a disclaimer on there that says that I strongly dispute the way they portrayed, the case. I think that that's an important thing to talk about because, not just the national media, but you have these documentaries and these podcasts and all these things that have come out since, and there are several that have done a great job. But in the documentary done by Oxygen, I remember at one point they came to me and they wanted to ask me something after I started off working with them at the beginning, before they were bought and before they brought in their big, director. And long story short, I remember I liked them and I was, working with them, and then at some point, we all felt the shift in the questioning, and we all saw that it had become a racial issue and that kinda thing, and so I remember having a discussion with one of the producers and just saying, "I don't like the way this is going now." And they picked and chose what they were gonna say and how they were gonna say it, so,
I need to
I
check
just
to
feel
make
like that
sure I
needs
don't have
to
an
be said.
IMDb page. I don't think I was on there enough to do.
Check and see because I did not
You
expect to
never
have one.
know.
Right.
Yeah,
So Jordan said, "That's what personally impresses and enlightens me about investigative journalists such as Therese.
Oh,
Getting out there and getting to know these officers and investigators both before and during the investigation shines a light on Leos as human beings. It affects them too. And from what I've heard, it means the world to acknowledge that they're doing everything they can. It consumes them. And that is absolutely the case here is that this team of investigators, up until I can say, Tim and Paul were both dear friends of mine. And Tim in 2024 and Paul just a few weeks ago, up until their very death, this was something that ate them alive. And John was no different. I wasn't as close to him as I was to them, but absolutely, this did consume these guys and still does. And I think that that's such an important part of any story that you tell, because you can't sit there and just let the narrative be, oh, the cops weren't doing anything.
Right.
Because on a case this big, of course they were.
Yeah. And I feel like when documentaries like that come in, everybody just wants to solve the crime. And that's kind of like a thing with crime, even crime podcasts. People listen to a podcast episode and they're like, I think I figured it out.
Right.
And they forget that there have been 11 years still ongoing of people who have day in and day out put in blood, sweat, and tears into these investigations. And if they can't find an answer, odds are you're not going to find one just listening to an hour-long episode of
Right.
bits and pieces, and especially when it's chopped like that and kind of pushing a certain narrative and not listening to the true story, or not even wanting to tell the true story, just telling the story that they want to tell for views.
Yeah.
And it definitely, I'm not a reporter. I'm not the reporter you are. I'm not an investigative anything. I'm not a first responder, but I cannot imagine the frustration that goes on when somebody thinks that they can step up like that and just come in and just almost ruin the whole thing.
Right. Well, and I think that's one of the interesting dynamics, is that there were so many people who thought because they read our articles or something that they were going to solve the case. And that goes back to, some of the online stuff and that kind of thing. And I recognize that is a part of, I don't know about you, but that's what kept me in business at the Clarion Ledger. I had great numbers because people want to read crime stories. But that was something that was hard for me to reconcile when I would write a story, a particularly rough story, especially in this case. And then I would get all these views on it and I'd be like, but y'all are just gawking. You don't even recognize that these are human beings. And I think probably there is a fine line there somewhere that I did not walk very well.
Yeah.
What do you think about that? Just kind of having to be the narrator in a story that is a story to some people, but is a real life to another.
Yeah, it's tough. You get jaded as a reporter because, especially in more recent years, as the online presence became greater and clicks became ever more important. There's a part of you that just gets giddy inside when you get a hold of a story that is going to get a lot of clicks, a lot of views. But then sometimes you step back and ask, what is the source of all this attention? This is people's lives we're dealing with. This is not some cute little feature, feel good feature that it's a win-win when something like that gets clicks. But when it's a story like this that really affects people, it's something devastating. You're glad that people are reading it, that it's getting the attention. But at the same time, you don't take any joy in it. There's nothing gleeful about it. It's a tough line you walk as a reporter. You like the attention, but you don't like that you're getting it at this cost.
Right, exactly. I would much rather 9 million people look at a story that I wrote about a basket of puppies.
Yeah.
To be fair.
That doesn't often happen, but it's nice when it does.
Right, exactly. So if you are Jay Hale, the district attorney in Panola County now, do you take this case back to trial?
I'm glad I'm not Jay Hale, because I just, unlike you, John Champion is probably the one I knew best at this.
Yeah.
And I know how it consumed him and how frustrated he got after 2 trials where the information was pretty compelling, especially in the second trial. It was fascinating to watch. And if I were in this case, if I were in Hale's shoes now, if they don't get justice in Louisiana, I think you're almost compelled to bring it back to Mississippi and try to make something happen. But I'm not sure where you go from here. It's been so long and so many key figures have died. If they have not been able to convince a jury yet, I'm not sure what Jay Hale does that would get it across the finish line on the third try.
Sure. And I want to take it back to the courtroom during those 2 trials, because of course you had probably around 10 first responders get up there and give the Eric and Derek narrative. I had talked to Daniel Cole, the EOC director that I mentioned earlier. I'd talked to him a couple weeks ago. And one of the things we talked about was like, what really happened? Like, we heard the what everybody said. And having been a volunteer firefighter, I can say, sure, I remember calls where it's like, okay, everybody go back to the station and write your report. So you're sitting there and you're like, what was the time? Does anybody know what time it was? And somebody says, oh, it was 6:02. And we're like, okay, 6:02. And so could this have been a situation where maybe all these people didn't actually hear that? And I think that was the question throughout the trial for me, is like, how is everybody, over here, he's saying it was breathy, I couldn't hear her. And then this guy over here is like, oh, she told me Eric did this to her. She said Eric did this to me. So I kind of sat down with Daniel. I was like, what was that? What was it? And Daniel said it was so breathy and it was hard to understand. And it was kind of more like, and so he said at that point, it's like he looked around, was like, did anybody hear that? Like, y'all listen close. Is she saying Eric? And so there was that going on that, at some point that may have informed some of their testimony. But then Darla Palmer is a phenomenal defense attorney. And she stepped up there, and at some point, I don't remember if it was during closing or during argument, but I think it was during closing. And she said, Eric's not on trial here, but he should be. Boom. I mean, you felt that in the courtroom, and so you were up against these great odds. And that's my question is, if you are looking at this case again, how do you overcome the Eric and Derek?
Yeah, I know they did. I was not familiar with Alton or Darla before this second trial, but they did just a masterful job as a defense team. People get down on defense attorneys. How can you defend these people? But they had a job to do, and you have to say they did it extremely well. She took hold of the Eric Derek thing, and she really drove that home with witness after witness after witness. She kept on, and she made the case that what was strong enough to overcome what was very compelling medical testimony from the other side too, about how, look, she could not possibly have been actually saying a name. She did not have the anatomical ability to do that anymore, as badly burned as she was. But it didn't matter. The two lines that stuck out to me, I think I wrote an analysis piece on it after that second trial. Two particular lines that stuck out to me. One was, I think the medical director from the Regional Medical Center in Memphis, which is where Jessica was brought, said that Darla was asking him about his testimony, and he said, that's why I said my mama didn't raise a liar, and that my mama didn't raise a liar with me line really stuck with me. But then Darla came back and said she walked, Eric and Derek walked and talked that night. Jessica said their names, and those two lines, just really stuck with me. And she just, again, the job she did driving that home was masterful. And I'm not sure how you overcome that if you tried it another trial.
Well, and plus it has had such life since that time. One of the witnesses in the Louisiana case is a guy named Eric Hill. And he apparently dated Quentin's sister at one point and was the cousin of Quentin's fiance, who he ended up marrying, Chiquita Jackson. So Eric Hill was the one that went to Louisiana police and said, hey, a guy told me that he tortured a girl to death for her PIN number. And so they asked him who, and they brought out the 6-pack, as they call it, with the photos. And he picked out a guy named Curtis Lemons. So they went looking for Curtis, and they bring Curtis in, and he had an alibi. And so they went back to Eric Hill, and Eric said, actually, it was Quentin Tellis. Well, so they move forward. Okay, we've got a name. It's Quentin Tellis, that kind of thing. And then at some point, Eric Hill retracts that statement. Now, the interesting part of this, and I'm throwing Eric Hill out here because so many people are like, yeah, well, nobody's talking about Eric Hill. Mm-hmm. I'm talking about him. We're talking about him right now. So the thing about it is Eric Hill retracts the statement, and the document that he writes has two sets of handwriting. One is consistent with Eric Hill. The other one is consistent with Quentin Tellis. So
how did I know you were going to say that?
Right. So there are things like that. And of course, we're not trying to say that, that it was Quentin, but it has been said by law enforcement that it is consistent with Quentin's handwriting. Yeah. So, there are things like that have taken on this life of their own through the last few years. And so how do you combat that? Would we, if we were to take it back to trial, Louisiana. I want to talk about that for a second before we get done. Ron, I know that you said you don't know a lot about Louisiana, but I'm going to bounce some of this off you and see what you think, if you don't mind. So it's a bench trial. The defense attorney moved to have a bench trial, and the judge granted it. Louisiana has a lot of different rules than we do here in Mississippi. For those of you that don't know what a bench trial is, it means no jury. This judge, Larry Jefferson, he's got a colorful past. At one point years ago, he threw a prosecutor out of his courtroom and banned him, and then threw out 41 cases because they didn't have a prosecutor to prosecute them.
Oh,
He's also been known to, when a jury returns a verdict of guilty, murder 2, he came back and said, "No, I think it's manslaughter. We're going to give him time served." Now, in both of those cases, I believe they overturned it on appeal, or he was censured or things like that. But he's a real wild card. And at one point, the ADA, Holly Jones, filed a motion to have him recuse himself because she said that there was some hostility between the two of them. And of course, he did not recuse himself. And, the appeal on that came back, and he's not recused. So there is a lot of concern about how this trial is going to go. What are your thoughts at the idea that Tellus might actually walk away from this, and then it might fall to Mississippi to bring this all back?
Well, it sounds like some of what you just talked about on the Louisiana judge. I had read that. In fact, it's probably your material I'd read when I was researching this. But yeah, he sounds like a real wild card. You don't know what you're going to get, and if as I've said, if justice is not served in Louisiana, it seems like there's going to have to be another attempt in Mississippi. I don't know how you just let him, basically walk away from the most serious outcome that he could get on these two cases. So it seems like it's got to be tried again. But I'm not sure where you go with it if you do. I just I would hate to be in that position because I'm not sure where you go, but I think it would have to come back to Mississippi if things don't happen in Louisiana. It's interesting. TV show, I think it was on Netflix, I was watching a couple of nights ago about a British courtroom drama, and I learned something from it. I didn't know that apparently in Britain you can have a majority verdict where ideally they want it to be unanimous, but if it's not unanimous, they can take a majority verdict as long as at least 10 agree. They'll still go with that, and
Wow.
it's too bad we don't do that in this country. I think if we had a majority verdict, I expect we might have already gotten some resolution in Mississippi.
Well, and I remember in the first trial, actually, the jury foreman told Tim Douglas that that there was one. I think it was it 10-2, or was it? I don't remember how it split, but I do know that Tim Douglas was told that there was one juror who said he was just not going to convict. He just wasn't.
Right. And of course, that's all it takes. I mean, if you have one holdout, then no matter how compelling the evidence was, that's all you need. So, I'm not the one to make judicial reforms, but it seems like something needs to happen.
Sure. Well, and I want to throw an aside in here. Our conversation is not in any way an attempt to pressure Mississippi to do this, because it is a hard case. I mean, there's a lot there that makes it, we've lost not only John, Tim, and Paul, but we've also lost Lisa Chambers, Jessica's mother. Her boyfriend, Travis Sanford, was shot in a dice game. There are several. Jerry King, the guy that found her car keys, has died. So there are multiple key players that are no longer on the table, and makes it a hard call for something like that.
And I feel like at this point, there's no way you're going to get a jury that has not heard or made their own opinion about what has happened.
Sure.
Yeah.
So even if you do give them evidence, we're all still human, especially it's a jury of common people. Like, it's going to be harder to convince them that their own opinion is wrong, rather
Right.
than presenting them information and them forming an opinion in that moment. It's been 11 years, and with all these, like we said, all these stories that come out, I feel like it's going to be really hard to get a impartial jury. And I never even thought about the fact that they would have to come up with, yes, it makes sense. They would have to either come up with new evidence, or somebody's holding on to something, and hopefully there is this golden egg that's gonna come, but it seems kind of like it's not gonna happen,
Right.
and that's kind of that's very disappointing.
Well, and I think that that becomes, kind of you hate to have the case that got away
Yeah.
because I mean, if Tellis is guilty of the things that he's been accused of, we do have a very dangerous situation here, and the crimes he's been accused of are the kind that it does seem as though you will commit again. Whoever has done these things is somebody that's not afraid to.
And
And
I
if
believe both juries were brought in from other counties in the first 2 trials, right?
right, right,
Okay. Well, I mean, but I mean, it's a national
yeah,
story, and I don't know, like, I mean, I feel like everywhere you go, it's like, what's the story of that little girl that was murdered that everybody knows about?
there's a couple of them.
I know, the one that everybody knows about, the pageant girl.
Oh,
Oh, JonBenet.
JonBenet. It's like like our local JonBenet Ramsey case, you know?
Right.
It's like, no matter where you go on a cruise, and it's like, "Oh, yeah, I've heard of Jessica Chambers. Isn't that the one where" dot,
Yeah.
and they just kinda dot, dot, dot. And even today, I was talking to somebody, and they're like, "Wasn't she pregnant?" And I was like, "I don't
No, that's
know."
Ally Costiel.
Yeah,
Yeah,
right, exactly, and I was like,
yeah,
"That's no, I'm pretty sure that's not the case," and then I kinda second guess in my brain, I'm like, "Well, am I thinking of something that, like"
yeah.
but, you just kinda have to go I would I've never been in a courtroom when a case like that is being presented, but
Right.
it's must be just like your heart must be going 1,000 miles a minute.
Sure. Well, and Ron, before we get too far off the trial, I do wanna ask you, what was it in the trial? Like, when you walk away, you've told us the 2 lines that you remember best. What did you remember the best as far as evidence, that was presented, or what do you think was the highlight of the trial?
Well, especially in the second trial, the thing that really struck me, and you probably working with law enforcement more than I do, maybe weren't quite as impressed by this. Maybe you knew how it worked, but how thorough a job, and I guess Paul was responsible for this, but how thorough a job they did with the cell phone data. It was really fascinating to see how they could almost pinpoint step by step exactly where they were at every moment. I think they went in together to Batesville, right, to a Taco Bell to buy a phone card or something. They were together then they track them coming back into Cortland. They're together in a field near Tellis's house. Then they separate and they find Jessica's car at the location where it was burning. I was just really fascinated by how thorough and how convincing they could be with the cell phone data, just the thoroughness of the case and how the time that investigators had put into piecing all this together. It didn't pay off for them, of course, in the outcome, but just the job that they did piecing all this together, I was amazed to watch. I had mentioned how great a job the defense team did, and they did, but the lasting impression was just what a thorough job the prosecution had done.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the women that worked for Oxygen, her husband was a big time trial attorney and actually approached Paul afterwards and was like, "You might be one of the best expert
Mhm.
witnesses I've ever seen."
Yeah, he
So
was
he
great.
definitely did a good job.
He was great. And I also left that trial, as I said, I knew John Champion better than any of them. And especially when he passed away later without ever seeing resolution to this, but even at the time of the trial, when there was a chance he would still get another crack at it if it came back, I just felt so badly for him after 2 tries that they had not been able to get a resolution on this because I knew how much time he had put in it. I thought of all the days I spent sitting in his office with him in Hernando with his Ole Miss paraphernalia all around him. And apologies to any Bully fans out there, but anybody who knows John knows he was a real Ole Miss fan. And we
To
spent
the
a lot of
bone.
we
Mhm.
spent a lot of time in his office talking about this, and he would get so frustrated that they had not been able to get any resolution to this. And I just came away feeling so badly for him and everyone else involved that, been 2 trials and they had still not been able to do anything.
Sure. Well, and I think that's why, of course, as reporters, we're supposed to maintain that objective voice, and so through the years when people ask me, did they have the right person? I just always say, if you had seen the case they put on, their evidence was almost flawless. You
Yeah,
got Eric and
that's
Derek in there,
right.
but otherwise
Mhm.
they had a case that they had put together very well.
I agree.
For me, the thing that sticks in my head the most, do you remember the video where and it was part of Paul's presentation, I think, where Tellus walks into the gas station after Jessica's been burned, and you've got the guy telling the story, and he's making the big motions about the fire and that kind of thing, and everybody's talking about it because it just happened, and just happened to somebody they knew, and Tellus just pays for his stuff and leaves.
Yeah.
And to me, if I had just been in a car with somebody all day and I had been begging them for sex by text, and I had been, doing all these things that they had documented. I mean, aside from any guilt, they had documented these things between Quentin and Jessica.
Yeah.
And if you had just had that all as a part of your last 2 weeks, and then you hear that that person was burned alive, do you just pay for your drink and leave?
Yeah. Yeah, I know.
The answer is you don't.
Yeah. There was also some medical testimony that stuck with me. They had some, and apologies, I don't mean to get too graphic, but when they were talking about the extent of her burns, they showed some photos just of an area, I think, of Jessica's leg, where you could see a few light pink areas, and the rest of it was really dark. And anyway, you were thinking, looking at the photo, well, it doesn't look that bad. But then they said, no, those small areas you're seeing that you think don't look that bad, I mean, those are the only areas where she's not burned. The rest of it was just, there was nothing left. And you begin to realize then that how horrific it was. I mean, there were very few areas of her body that were just not totally incinerated.
Yeah, and I think when they described to us how it actually, in essence, when you're in that situation, you are cooked. And they talked about how if you cook another piece of meat, how it gets hard and it, tightens up. And when I was talking to Daniel Cole a couple of weeks ago, he was talking about how when they couldn't understand Jessica, they gave her a pen and paper and tried to get her to write it, but she couldn't even bring her arms together to put it on paper because that's how burned she was.
Yeah.
So the medical evidence definitely lent itself to really not being able to understand what she said,
Right.
or what she was attempting to say in that moment.
Yeah.
So, well, Ron, any parting thoughts? Can you think of anything you feel like we need to touch on that we haven't?
It seems like we've covered the ground pretty well. Like I said, I just I feel sorry that so many people, Jessica's mom and the authorities, that I feel sorry they didn't get resolution. And the one thing we haven't necessarily talked about is just the impact that it had on the community. I talked to some people, including I think her name's Melissa Phelps. She was the Panola County court clerk she was involved in the trial, but she was also a lifelong Cortland resident. And she talked about how it was a horrible case, but she really felt badly about the way it had scarred their community as well. Cortland is a community that had already, it had its blows. Like a lot of smaller communities, people had left. There had been demographic changes over the years, and there weren't a lot of people left there, but they were proud of what they had. And she talked about what a close-knit community it was and how in some ways idyllic it was. I think the Christmas train that they did every year, I don't know if it still runs, but at the time, its route went through Batesville and would go in Cortland, and it was just a lovely little community. And she talked about how this had left a permanent scar on the community. And I think it's worth mentioning that not just the individuals who were affected by this, and there were many who were, and they deserve all of our sympathy, but just the community as a whole, the way it affected them. I mean, it left some scars on them that won't heal either. And I really feel sorry for the community, and hope for the entire community's sake that they get some resolution to this also.
Absolutely. And, I do want to say that I was out there a couple of weeks ago at the scene at Heron Road, and they've rebuilt the fence and they've done a lot of things that I don't know if they meant to try to make it look different or if it was just because it's a decade later and it looks different. But, the thing that stuck with me, and I don't know if I can say this without choking up, the trees are still black.
Yeah.
The trees are still burned black at that spot. Carolyn's telling us the train doesn't run anymore, which is so sad.
That's too bad.
Yeah. So, I guess, so to kind of wrap it up, I feel like we've addressed a lot of the things. Unfortunately, this case is one that we could talk about for weeks. And, I feel like between the case itself and the trials and all the aftermath, there's so much there.
Yeah, I think so too. It's best of luck to you covering it in Louisiana. I hope we get a resolution there.
Man, I do too. And again, I just want to say again how much this case has affected all of us, but to the families of John Champion and Tim Douglas and Paul Rowlett. I don't know that we ever see a resolution, but just know that there are still a lot of us out there that are working on it.
Absolutely.
So, Nicole, any parting thoughts?
I don't think there's anything I can really contribute that is just going to supersede anything you said. I knew you always ask me that, and I knew this time I was like, there's nothing that I'm going to be able to contribute to this. It's just, I hope with every fiber of my being that this case can be resolved. It deserves, for her, for Jessica, for her family, for you, for everybody we've lost along the way. They all deserve an answer, and maybe they have the answer now.
Mm-hmm.
And, they're somewhere with her and they'll be like, girl, what happened?
Right.
Tell us what happened. And if they could just send us a message, that's
right.
great. But the legal system itself is testy and it's touchy, and that's kind of why we have it is, you never want to put somebody who didn't deserve it in jail. But when you look at all the facts, when you are in court, when you've been through it for 11 years, you kind of just know, I feel like. And you can sit here and tell people till you're blue in the face how you think it is. But until it goes through the jury, beyond a reasonable doubt.
Or the judge in Louisiana.
Or the judge in Louisiana, yeah. Well, we'll pray for him.
That's right.
And I'm very curious to see how that goes, because Louisiana is a whole different ball game.
Whole different court system.
Yeah.
They do everything different.
I was asking my fiance Adam, I was like, why would they even do a bench trial? Like, this doesn't even make sense. And blah, blah, blah. Well, this was Quentin Tellis, and this was the case, and this is what happened. And he was like, why would they do that? And I said, but it's in Louisiana. He goes, that's why.
Because Louisiana.
That's exactly why. So,
Yeah.
I really, like I said, I really just hope for everybody it gets resolved soon, like whether one way or another, and I hope it's the way we all want it to go. Where is Quentin right now? Like, is he in Louisiana or is he
He's
here
in
in
Louisiana? Yeah.
Okay.
So he was here in Mississippi up until a few weeks ago when they moved him to Louisiana.
So they're
for
just
the
kind of
trial.
moving him back and forth depending on where he's.
Well, I mean, in essence, yeah, but
Okay.
they took him back to Louisiana because his trial was supposed to be December 1st, and
Right.
that was when Paul was killed, and they
Right.
got the continuance. So I'll go ahead and just kind of wrap us up. I've talked to the people who love the investigators that are not with us anymore, to Jessica's family, AJ especially, and Ben. Her voice is not silenced, and to the rest of you, Paul's, Tim's, John's. No, we're going to get this done. And Jay, whatever you decide, we're with you. But thank you guys all for watching. Thank you for tuning in. This case obviously is one that's very important to me and to Ron. Ron, thank you for being with us.
Thank you,
Thanks
Ron.
for having me.
Absolutely. So we'll bring you back sometime.
I'm available.
All right. Good deal.
Good.
Thank y'all so much for watching. You can find us on all the podcast platforms, and we'll see you again in a couple of weeks after the holidays.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.